On April, yeah, I want to make sure I have the date right because I don't normally do this, but I'm going to talk about Caesar Shaw. On April 12th, in 1782, Nathaniel Shaw Jr., the man who owned this house, he was the Navy agent for the colony of Connecticut. He was on Groton Long Point and he was hunting. And he accidentally shot himself in the stomach. And he was brought back here and he lay dying. And he dictated his will to his brother Thomas, who's on the wall over there. I should move the camera so we move around. But Wendy knows what Thomas looks like. I think she's the only one in our audience on YouTube. So he dictated his will to Thomas, and in that will, he emancipated all 10 of the enslaved people in this house in 1782. All 10. And that wasn't uncommon at the time for Northerners, New Englanders, to emancipate slaves at about 1782. Other people were doing it. What was unusual about Shaw's will is he arranged for an annuity for 2 of the enslaved peoples in this house. Caesar Shaw, who was the oldest, and Celia Shaw, who was the youngest. And they received $10 a year for the rest of their lives. Caesar was born into enslavement in this house in 1760. Now, he was born into a home of an affluent family. The Shaw mansion has 3 stories. The Shaws were maritime merchants. In fact, they were part of a rising merchant class that you saw during the American Revolution, especially in the North. The Navigation Acts limited the kind of trade any colonies could do. So the only trade you could do with Europe was selling raw goods. So they did lumber and livestock and things like that, and you could get raw goods in return. But you couldn't sell manufactured goods. So I could sell the hoops, the stabs, and the ends of barrels, but I couldn't sell barrels. The Shaws, in order to push against that, and actually all the merchants in the area, in order to push against that, did create a network of manufactured goods because the Navigation Acts didn't forbid you from trading with other colonies. So the Shaw family created a significant network of trade throughout the West Indies and even through the Americas in general. So, and they would trade, actually, they went to Ireland and they got flaxseed. And Nathaniel Shaw had about 400 acres in Waterford and he grew flax. And he had it spun and woven into sailcloth. And he sold sailcloth and he made a lot of money doing it. This is not Nathaniel Shaw Jr., this is Nathaniel Shaw, his father. So Caesar's experience in this home when he was born was he wasn't living in an attic or outside or in a pallet. He lived on the 3rd floor in one of 5 bedrooms, and there were 2 common rooms up there. So there weren't any fireplaces up there, but all the heat from all the fireplaces in this house was going up there anyways. So his upbringing in that environment was very different from a lot of his contemporaries. Even when we talk about Adam Jackson, he did sleep in the attic of the Hempstead home, which was much smaller, and he slept with the sons at the Hempsteads. But it was an open attic, and there was a bed. And likely Caesar shared the room with his mother. And then as he got older and moved away from his mother, he probably shared another room with a younger child. And they probably put space heaters up there when it got cold. Laboring on a plantation, because Connecticut really didn't have cash crop plantations. I even looked up tobacco, because Connecticut had tobacco. And they didn't run, it was an additional crop. It wasn't a monocrop for cash. So they grew this and then they grew tobacco. So they didn't have the kind of, and that, I'm not saying that there were absolutely none, but typically they didn't have the kind of plantation labor that the South had, where you monocrop for cash crop and you had a very large group of enslaved people. Caesar Shaw was here in New England, and he would not be enslaved and work in the house, and he wouldn't be working a plantation. Nathaniel Shaw was a maritime merchant. Caesar was destined for a life at sea. So, depending on his age, and again, mariners in Connecticut was part of the maritime world. It was part of New England. Mariners were the engine of imperialism and capitalism. So the need for mariners was important. And Shaw likely placed Caesar on board a ship when he was 12, depending on his height. So you had to be a certain height, and boys typically attained it when they reached the age of 12. So, and I think it was 5'3". No, it was 4 feet 6 inches. The moment Caesar's foot hit the deck of the ship is the moment his life changed, because he was no longer subject to English common law. He was subject to admiralty law. It's Blue's Clues, right? Did I get that right? Blue's Clues, wasn't that the sound? I am. Wow, that's an old memory. So, and admiralty law was designed to ensure that mariners were working ships and they were moving. And admiralty law did not recognize race when it marginalized people. It marginalized everybody equally. Ironically, because Caesar was part of maritime law and marginalized like a mariner, he ended up with more agency to affect change in his own life than he would if he had stayed on land or worked the plantation elsewhere. So, admiralty law was designed to limit agency. Caesar got more, and you needed to ensure that the goods were moving and the economy was growing. So, and Nathaniel Shaw would use Caesar on board his ships. And the reason we know this, we looked at the records, and there are 2 instances of Caesar being on ships, but the last is in the 19th century. And he's sailing as a ship's cook, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But in order for him to be a ship's cook, he had to do his time in the ranks. So he probably started when he was age 12, as I said, and he was assigned to the deck as a ship's boy, and he would do those tasks that a ship's boy would do on a maritime merchant ship. So now you have a situation where it's the officers and captains of both the military and mercantile ship which are determining what is right, what is wrong, and how you punish people under maritime law. So you have those rules, but each ship is its own universe, captain's in charge. And that changes, right? But that's how it works. So there's not lawyers, there's not other kinds of mechanisms for, there aren't lawyers, there aren't judges. It's captains and officers. Now, I mentioned that Caesar was not living like he was with his contemporaries. He had more agency as a sailor, as a mariner, than any of his contemporaries working plantations. And by design, plantations were a very lonely place. Frederick Douglass commented on it because he had both experiences. He worked plantations and he worked ships. And he said the plantations are a very lonely place because they were set apart. And the enslaved people who worked them were set apart. And you didn't see them. Caesar was now he was a mariner. He was a sailor in a maritime community. There were lots of black mariners throughout the North. He was stratified within the culture and within the community. It was not uncommon to see an African or African American sailor in uniform walking on land. It became normalized in the northern part of the country, mainly New England, but any port city. So the problem that all of these people faced, all of these enslaved people faced, was when they were born, they were given an identity, and that identity was commodity. They weren't a person, they were a commodity. And that impacted their own self-identity, right? And eventually, you have this institutionalization. However, a unique situation happened, especially for Caesar when he entered the maritime world, because he would work alongside the rest of the crew regardless of color. He would eat with them. He would berth with them. When he did his job, he received the same little oversight when he did it. There weren't people looking over his shoulder and making sure that he did his job. If he didn't do it, they would know about it and he would be punished just like any other mariner, regardless of race. And he's now got an additional identity. He still will always, always, always fight this idea that he's a commodity. However, he's now a mariner too. So, and you didn't see segregation on ships, and if there were, the black mariners segregated themselves from the white mariners because they approached their jobs and their lives differently. And well, yes, because of the marginalization, but not in the typical way where like saying they have to be over there. They said we're over here because of how we are identifying ourselves and how we're being identified as commodity and mariner. But now our self-awareness and our own self-image is improved because not only are we a mariner, but we have the opportunity to rise through the ranks. So Caesar Shaw could have sat on a ship, and he could have been on the Queen Anne, which was one of Shaw's ships, and he could have been at the mouth of the harbor, and the captain gives way to the pilot who parks the ship on any harbor, and that pilot could have been an enslaved pilot or even a freed pilot. So this is a person, an African American, who rose their way through the ranks, and now they are stepping on board a ship and taking command. The captain takes orders from the pilot when he is steering the ship into port. He probably heard of Acquiano, Captain Oleda Acquiano, who was an enslaved African who bought his freedom and rose through the ranks and became a captain. There were ships out there with entire crews of black mariners. And it was a unique situation if you were a pilot on the water or you were an enslaved person on a ship, and you're away from society, you're on that small microcosm on the water, you are, in essence, free for a moment from your bondage because there's no one there to support that idea. So you have these moments of freedom, which impacts identity. But the biggest thing that Caesar had was an education. He was being trained in maritime professions. He was traveling around the world. Mariners knew how to write. Caesar didn't know how to write. I put up on YouTube a receipt for the $10 annuity that he was paid for the rest of his life, and he made his mark under Caesar Shaw. I didn't pull out the document because I know where it was, and it would take some time to get to it. So, and he could speak with black mariners around the globe, and they did. They had a large network that shared information, kept their members informed, discussed what was going on in the world, around the world. So the Haitian rebellion was being talked about. They would learn things from each other. The other thing that happened, which was unique, whether you were born African or you were born American, they would get together and approach their work and discuss their ideas, all right, together, but they brought to their work traditional African ideas of reverence for the water and spirituality. They brought that to their work. And regardless of whether they were enslaved Africans or enslaved African Americans, this kind of bond and these kind of ideas spread among them. So they forged this community based on African ideas, maritime ideas, American ideas, all grounded in reverence and spirituality. And now they're forging this collective identity that is pushing against the idea of commodity. And they would always have to fight it. The other unique thing about Caesar Shaw being a mariner here in the North is because you saw these people stratified, these enslaved and even freed black men are stratified through the community. You had the institutional racism that you always had, but it manifested a little differently because Caesar Shaw couldn't walk up against a person and know immediately what their ideas about enslavement was and about his identity was. So every time he encountered somebody who was white, he had to suss out what their attitude was. Where if you were in the South, you knew what they thought. So his experience was different. And we talked about it. We had a discussion this morning about it. And when you look at it, it's that identity that has been imposed which causes you to be treated in a very specific way. It was horrible in the North. It was horrible in the South. But it manifested differently. So as I stand here and kind of describe it, I don't want people to think I'm apologizing for what happened here. It was wrong what happened here. But Caesar Shaw experienced things in a very different way, but every day he was being marginalized. Every day he was thought of as a commodity, no matter how well he was treated. And he had to fight that identity his entire life. In the 18th century, nearly 1/5 of the population of New London, 1/5 were African or African American. 1/5. They worked the docks, they worked the ships, just as I talked about. They worked all through the society. And Caesar, that's why Caesar would have to suss out. We're moving along pretty good here. I don't normally look at notes, but I really wanted to hit this one hard. In Connecticut, enslaved and freed black mariners were paid the same as everybody else. On land, it wasn't the same. White person earned more money. But at sea, because admiralty law ruled, everybody made the same kind of money. Now, it didn't mean you could spend it in the same way. And it didn't mean that they didn't try and get it from you in different ways, but everybody got the same rate of pay. And he also had the same opportunities. So there were opportunities for even enslaved mariners whose wage was going back to the person who enslaved them to earn their own wages. And we know Venture Smith took side jobs, and that was the deal from the beginning. He took side jobs and earned his own money to buy his freedom. There were ways that you, as a mariner aboard a ship, could earn extra money. You were allotted some storage within the hold. You could buy goods from one port. You could keep those goods in that storage, and you could go to another port and sell those goods for money. And you could make a profit doing this, and they could earn their own money that way. When the American Revolution happened, privateering was a way for enslaved people, and I'll go into that when I start talking about it, was a way for enslaved people to make money when they were at sea and buy their freedom. And you heard a number of instances where they did just that. When Caesar stepped aboard, he was likely trained as a ship's boy and eventually became a common sailor. It was common for black mariners to be assigned the job of steward and cook. All right, and this didn't change until the 20th century. However, and then interestingly enough, they decided that they owned those jobs collectively. So black mariners decided they owned the jobs of steward and cook. And then as the years progressed, when we saw the turn of the century in the 19th century, the value of the ship's cook actually increased because they knew a good ship's cook meant a happy crew. And by the early 19th century, when Caesar signed on board as a cook, his pay wasn't that of an average sailor. He was making as much money as the second mate on board the ship. That's what they were paying the cook. So there were African Americans who were trained as cooks on land just so they could go to sea and make more money. So that was really unique. So now Caesar's 15 and the Americans break away from the British. We declare independence, become the United States. He's 15 years old. He's been on board a ship for at least 3 years. So he's probably a common or able seaman. And now he's going to be here. Now he was placed on a privateer. So a choice was made for him. Nathaniel Shaw Jr. was named the Continental Agent for the colony of Connecticut. He was named the Naval Agent for the Continental Agent for the Continental Congress. His job was to administer the Navy in the state of Connecticut. So anything that was happening at sea, whether it's mercantile or military, Shaw was involved. All right, and privateering was the biggest and most lucrative exercise that was going on during the American Revolution. And we talked about Shaw before that. I actually went on ad nauseum about privateering. So that video might be out somewhere. But if you want, call me and I'll talk to you for 2 hours on privateering. It was incredibly lucrative. A common sailor on a privateer made 3 times the money they made on any other ship. Now, this is not pay, this is prize money. And as prize money, if an enslaved person is working the ship, they're due that prize money. So Caesar Shaw had a choice made for him. Some contemporaries happened. So now we had the question, when the revolution happened, we have Africans, enslaved Africans and enslaved African Americans in this colony, and we see them, we see the people in charge start discussing how are we going to approach this idea, because what they're asking someone who's enslaved is that we're going to ask you to defend the people who are oppressing you with your life if necessary. So you really have to contemplate that question, right? So that's what they were really asking what to do. So they talked a lot about it. So and then each state did the same thing. They came up with different ideas. And making matters more complex is the years leading up to revolution. Mariners who could read and who were part of this big network learned the language of revolution. And then they started petitioning governments, writing petitions in both Massachusetts and Connecticut, petitioning the governments for more rights and for better treatment. And they learned that from the American Revolution and what that language was and how that looked. So you see this, again, very unique situation happening up here in the north. When the Continental Army happened, anyone between 16 and 50 was obliged to serve. So since Caesar Shaw, and as they're talking about the questions, but since Caesar Shaw was a privateer, he kind of was in, but it really didn't count as malicious service. But when we saw the Minerva and the men who signed aboard the Continental Navy and refused to go on the first Minerva mission, the only punishment they received was, you can't be in the Continental Navy anymore. So even though there was this mandatory service, how are you going to enforce those people who didn't do it? And then on top of it, the people in Connecticut who weren't doing this mandatory service, they were privateers. And privateering was making so much money that the Continental Navy couldn't get mariners, and Essex Hopkins got fired because of it. So the government wasn't really interested in chasing down men who were serving aboard privateers. However, the mandatory service was there, and Connecticut decided to discuss it. So in 1777, they decided that they decided to discuss the idea of taking an enslaved person and putting him in the military, with the person who was doing the enslaving receiving the sign-on bonus and the pay. And the Connecticut Assembly struck it down. They said, we're not going to do that. However, they did say, you can use an enslaved person as a substitute for your service. So another legislation item was being discussed. Another idea was being discussed, and that was, if that happened, if anybody served, they would be emancipated. And the upper house of the assembly approved it. The lower house struck it down. However, the people in New London who wanted to do that did emancipate any enslaved person who agreed to be their substitute and take on that. So the people themselves did it regardless of the law. In other states, you saw emancipation. Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia at the outset, the British governor of Virginia at the outset of the American Revolution, offered emancipation to any enslaved person who left the colonies. And then Clinton did the same thing later on. So enslaved people could leave the Americas, they could join the British, and they would be emancipated. And that ends up being a little difficult at the end, and I'll talk about that at the end of the lecture. Washington and what happened with those people. Those people who were enslaved and got caught, if they were a mariner, they were actually sold to a plantation on the West Indies as punishment. In Virginia, because you talk about compensation, how are you going to be compensated for joining the military? In Pennsylvania, before they signed into the militia, they insisted that they be given land grants that couldn't be taken away. In Virginia, they gave everyone who signed up a person to be enslaved. That was their compensation. So in Virginia, we're looking at this really horrible idea of commodity down there. I just can't even think about it. But you saw that in Virginia. In Connecticut, they got so good at recruiting African and African Americans, especially when they were emancipated, that I want to make sure I get this right. It was the 4th. The 4th Connecticut had an entire company of black militia members. An entire company here in Connecticut. Now, Caesar is aboard a privateer and he's making money. There was an enslaved privateer in East Lyme named Prince who used privateering to free himself. Caesar never had the opportunity to use money to free himself because when Nathaniel Shaw died, he did it. both sides were offering emancipation in a certain way, but it depended on where you were. Up north, you saw it more, but the British were doing it down south. They were offering emancipation, and the enslaved people were running the American Revolution, and they fought. A man named Peter Salem fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was an African-American freed militiaman who killed Pitcairn. He shot him in the head. So, and there's a Jonathan Trumbull's son did a painting of it, so you can see that. The revolution is going, and in 1779, Caesar Shaw married Ada Shaw. This made her a maritime wife. So, and there was still an enslavement aspect of things, but as a maritime wife, even within a black mariner, the wife was now responsible for the household while the husband was away. And wives could have side hustles. They could earn money to support the house while they were waiting for paychecks. They could, do piecework. They could do laundry. It's unlikely that Caesar and his wife faced that kind of issue because of his circumstance. Some mariners' wives, some black mariners' wives actually were forced into prostitution in order to make ends meet.
Did you say prostitution?
Yes, ma'am, prostitution. It's just more additional marginalization. That's just how, there wasn't work. You saw that prejudice working, and that's how this sometimes ended up. Now, I doubt, based on how Caesar's life played out, I doubt he saw that kind of hardship. And when we come to the end, I'll talk about why. When Caesar was finally emancipated and receiving his $10 pension, he and Ada began having children. They had 3 sons. Their names were Prince Ichabod and Caesar Jr. By 1792, the war was over, and Caesar paid for a piece of property here in New London. He paid $30 for a piece of property. And then 2 years later, he purchased from Thomas Shaw more property for $100. So he had a large chunk. The land records don't tell us how big of the property he had, but he had it here. Now this, again, is unique to Caesar because black mariners were often denied the ability to purchase property. And it was because of race and prejudice, but it was also to ensure that mariners didn't, ensured that they didn't have an opportunity to break free of the wages from the maritime world. So we had to keep them on ships, we had to keep them working. And if they had property on land, if they weren't paying rents, then they would have the ability to not have to be at sea. Ada passed away in 1809, and all 3 of Caesar's children with Ada predeceased him. He married, 2 years later, he married Jenny Freeman. And Jenny Freeman was probably the daughter of an emancipated man who signed up for the militia. Because when they signed up, they needed a new surname, and they often said Freeman or Liberty. So Jenny Freeman was the daughter of someone who had been emancipated because they served in the Connecticut militia. And together they had 4 children. The last time we see a record of Caesar Shaw is in 1827. I'm not 1827, I'm sorry. Last time, I'm sorry, I don't have a date on it. He was listed as cook aboard the Cordelia going to the West Indies. So this is in the turn of the century. He's making good money as a cook on the Cordelia. And he owns 2 pieces of land here. In 1827, Caesar Shaw dies. In his obituary in the Connecticut Gazette reads, Caesar Shaw, a respectable man of color, age 68. Caesar Shaw is a classic example of enslaved men who worked in the North in the maritime industry. He participated in the Revolution in a different way than you saw Africans and African Americans participating down south. There were units who were formed. Dunmore formed an entire unit of people who ran to the British. He called them units, called them Ethiopian units. Here you saw Connecticut emancipating and using emancipation in order to entice African and African Americans to serve. Privateering was a popular vehicle. They couldn't get white people to be part of the militia because privateering was so lucrative. It was different. It was different service. You joined on board a privateer. Your paycheck went up 150%, and you were only out for 2 weeks. So you'd be out for 2 weeks. You'd come home, and then you could sign on to another privateer whenever you wanted. And then that prize money could be used to purchase your freedom, which is something that we know that they could do here in the Northeast. You have a maritime identity. It was very different. He had an identity that didn't necessarily replace his imposed identity because we're institutionalized by this point, but it was something in addition to. And he had a better self-identity. He had a better self-appreciation. He worked his way up to a job that he felt was his, which was ship's cook. And he was making enough money to purchase land in New London. Now, the difference for Caesar Shaw in his experience is the Shaws enslaved him and they emancipated him, but they were also his patron. He was the patron. The Shaws they were an affluent family who looked to him and took care of him, and they were almost patrons for him. Okay, and honestly, we really should do a DNA test on Caesar and Celia because the way he has assailed his life and moved through it, there's a good chance we can infer that he was a Shaw. He was actually a Shaw. Entering the maritime field made him subject to maritime law. Even when we broke away from the British, the American maritime law mirrored admiralty law, and it was a paradoxical effect for any black mariner because it both marginalized him but also improved his situation and provided him more agency to affect more change in his own life. However, if he got involved in piracy, he could find himself a commodity again and being sold. So that was always there. I think I saw you raise a hand. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I just kind of got stuck when you said that it was possible that he was an actual Shaw. So does that then bring rape into play? And what his wife had, she would have known.
If he was, and I don't have an answer one way or another for that. It could be. It could be. They treated he was treated differently. Okay, we just based on the research that I've done, and even when you look at the maritime world and looking at an enslaved man in the maritime Northeast and in the South, their lives are very different, unequivocally. Okay, both treated as commodity, but you have more agency in the North. You don't have freedom, but you have agency. And even amid those, if I compare Caesar's life to those mariners in the Northeast, I see that they weren't being allowed to buy property, yet here's Caesar Shaw buying property, okay, and getting a pension of $10 a year for the rest of his life. Okay, so these are things that helped him along.
And
Okay.
all these things very hush-hush.
Well, yes, there would, well, there is no written record of it, but I don't know if it would have been. Because again, the way that we're looking at it, and the way that we're looking at it and the way that they're moving around in it, and the way that they're existing within the stratification within the community, how hush-hush could it have been, right? So, and then at the end of the day, we're still looking at the way the Shaws are moving through. So I can't, okay, so the other thing that we're bumping up against is I'm a postmodernist historian. So I can't look at you and say, yes, it was like this. That's not in me to do. I can do a lot of inferring, and yes, it could have been a rape, but there were 2 children. So maybe it could have happened twice, but they were the oldest and the youngest. Okay, so, right, so they were the oldest and the youngest. So,
weren't we also looking at the dates of their birth?
Yes, at the dates.
I'm not sure whether this was Nathaniel Shaw's possible children or possible brothers.
And then the other thing is Thomas never married, but Thomas never married, never had any children. Okay, so he might, who knows, he might have been in a relationship. We're now engaging in speculative history. We're engaging in speculative history. Okay, so all I can say is that it is likely he carried some Shaw genetics, and he benefited from that in very specific ways. Okay, because he bought land from Thomas. Okay. He bought land from Thomas. So, and it took him 10 years to save that. So if we do the math, that's all of his pension money for 10 years, exchanged for property. All right. So he banked that $10, and he was living on his maritime pay, and he went to Thomas and bought land. Okay. And Thomas sold it to him. All right. And Thomas was writing checks, and after Thomas died, Elias Perkins, who married Mary's daughter, he wasn't writing checks, he was giving money and writing receipts. Okay, so they took care of Caesar until he died with $10 a year. We're talking about $200. But he managed to save it for 10 years and buy a piece of land, something that was being denied to other people. And actually, it's so funny because that's kind of you actually asked me, and it's how my last paragraph wraps up within this. I picked Caesar because I didn't know a lot about him, and when I wanted to talk about something, I'd like to talk about an event. I can stand up here and say, well, the Connecticut legislation, and this person voted for this and this, or I can tell you a story about a person. As I learned more, it was fascinating. It was fascinating the way that his life went, and his was different than probably I can say all of his contemporaries, but he had agencies in different ways. And then there were other men who were enslaved in the North who were freed and rose to the rank of captain, right? Became pilots, and pilots are and even now, today, pilots is a sought after job and a very lucrative job, and then they could earn extra money. If you were enslaved and you were made a pilot, you were sent out at a specific rate, and any money you made above and beyond was yours to keep. So here we have this also unique experience of you actually earning money here in New England. And then, we can inject, and I didn't go that far afield, but when, we have to talk about Quakers now too, and those ideas, because the New England is a maritime world. So this is a community of people who always have something to do with the sea, traveling to different ports, encountering different ports, living there. Because if you were a mariner, you weren't from New London. You were from New London if you were born here, but you took a job anywhere. And if you were a black mariner who was freed, okay, you could take a berth on any ship in any country. because you were now part of an international world. Okay? And there was an international network spreading information, educating people. And then, as I said before, now we have these group of individuals that are mired, that are stabilized within African traditions and a reverence for the sea, and they bring the spirituality and they kind of form an identity. We were talking about African and African American and West Indian when you think about West Indian, but the West Indian identity wasn't really kind of formalized until much later. And if I did more research, I would argue it was born out of what I'm talking about right now, which was this kind of, we want an identity that is not commodity.
And that's where Marcus Garvey was from, right?
I'm sorry?
And that's where Marcus Garvey was from, the West Indies.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But even if you were born in the West Indies, you were considered African American because it was the Americas. So you didn't see that identity until much later. All right. But what we're seeing now, when this is happening, when the triangle trade happens and the West Africans, who were the canoe people, are bringing their ideas to what it means to be on the sea, and the spirituality and the spirits of the dead people who are still in the sea and their owed reverence, these ideas are brought to this. And then you see Africans and African Americans coming together and forming a community, and then sharing these ideas, and then they're kind of replacing, at least for themselves, this identity that we are commodity, so it's not even that we're people, right? Where we all agree, we have to agree we're all people, but who are we as a people? So you start seeing this in the maritime world, and it's incredibly fascinating, right? Because and this is the other thing I preach. There's always agency against authority, no matter where it is. You always see people looking for agency against authority. And the maritime world provided us a unique opportunity. They traded one authority for another, but the other authority, they had more agency. So it was better than this life over here. Frederick Douglass escaped his enslavement by dressing up like a sailor, and he just walked out. He didn't even run. He just walked. He was a ship's caulker. So when you put boards together, you drive oakum between them and you seal it with tar to make things waterproof. And he left Maryland dressed in the sailor's outfit, and he went to Boston because he was a maritime person and he wanted a job. So he went to Charlestown and he said, I'm a ship's caulker, I'd like a job. And they said, you can't have a job, because he was from Maryland. So, it's interesting, because maritime history is my thing, but the research that I did, the reading that I did, incredibly eye-opening for me, because I'm on the panel next week for Nicole, and she gave me a list of questions, and what stuck out, so this is kind of Nicole's fault. What stuck out for me was, why is it different in the North? Why don't we look at it the same way? And then I thought, well, we all agree, right? Enslavement is horrible. But even going down to that, and I keep saying this, at the end, and we did it to women too, right? Women were their husband, women were chattel, women were their husband. But when we looked at an enslaved person, in order to assuage that idea that we can do this to this person, they had to be a not person. And then we assign them the identity of commodity, right? And you see capitalism doing that all the time. We need to assign you identity. Here in this country, even everybody, we look at our children and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? The moment we do that is the moment we tell them what you do is who you are. And if what you do is who you are, you can be exploited. So if you're nothing but commodity, you can be exploited. And if you make it institutionalized, you become complacent in it. Yeah.
If you use the term agency, can you explain what the difference is between, where I'm going?
What the difference is between freedom and agency? Freedom would be your ability to do what it is you want whenever you want. Agency is working within an oppressive system to improve your situation and get some of what you want. It's the agency to affect change in your own life. Okay, so if you look at it now, even as we exist today, regardless of what our race is, all right, we are all seeking to have agency against authority as we're moving through the world, right? So, okay, so here, this is the Oliver Cromwell conquers Ireland, and he enslaves the Irish. And he sends them to the plantations in the West Indies. Now the triangle trade happens. Now the Africans are going to the West Indies. This is in 1654, 1650s. The Irish and the Africans got together and say, this is horrible. We don't want to do this. And they join forces and they rebel against the plantation owners. And the British regulars have to be called in to put down the rebellion. And when it was done, the plantation owners walked in and they looked at the Irish and they said, you are no longer enslaved. You're indentured servants. And here's some pay and the window to your freedom. You see those people over there? They want what you have. Don't let them have it. And the minute they divided the Africans and the Irish was the minute they didn't have to worry about their privilege. And that class of people are still doing it today. Are still doing it today. And what it is, and we talk about this, you know, what anybody ever wants. You want freedom? Here's your definition of freedom. You have a seat at the table. Everything else is agency. If you don't have a seat at the table, everything else is agency. And then there are those people who have a seat at the table, and then those people who don't. And the darker your skin is the further you're away from that chair. And that's how it works. And that's how it's worked since the 1600s. So that's the difference between freedom and agency. Freedom is the ability to live your life exactly the way you want to live it without imposition. Agency is the ability to affect change in your own life for a perceived better or for the better. Okay? You're not free to do that. We have a whole lot of laws in this country. We have a whole lot of institutional ideas in not only this country, but every country, which limit our freedoms, and we don't even know it. Like I said, from the very beginning, we're put in from just a moment ago. We look at a child and say, what do you want to be when you grow up? And this is a unique capitalism kind of thing. Now we're in a very different lecture, and we're going to have to delete this before NSA gets to me. But I'm a historian, and history is the search for the truth. I opened a book, and the guy said, well, history is recounting the facts about an event that happened. And I wanted to close it because he's so wrong. History is a philosophy, and it's about getting at the truth. Now, I have the hard time because I'm a postmodernist, and I don't believe there's an objective truth. But we can infer different ideas, and we can look at a situation and say, yeah, you know what? A lot of people were there, and they all agreed this happened. Okay? So we are seeing our country being born, all right? Remember, the intolerable acts became, you know, the oppression only became intolerable when rich white people had to pay money, okay? Privateering was so lucrative. I didn't tell the Minerva story, and Jim, you must have heard the Minerva story. I've told it 1,000 times. The Minerva crew refused to go because they didn't have a dog in the race. As a mariner, they knew that if the Americans were in charge of them, or the British were in charge of them, it wouldn't change. Before there were the Sons of Liberty, there were the Sons of Neptune. And they were organizing. Crispus Attucks was a mariner who organized, right? He was a whaleman. He was a black mariner, whaleman who organized, got killed for this country, all right? And then the people who shot him got off because he was scary. So there's always going to be, you see pushback, there's always going to be, and that's movements, right? Think about the beat movement. which was pushing against what was the war and everything that was going on at the time, and it turned into the hippie movement, right? You think about it, there's always these movements of agency against authority. And then eventually they become the authority and they push it against it. I could get in real trouble and start talking about the woke movement. Oh, I really went off the rails. You all have to stop asking questions. So is there any other questions? I really thank you for coming. I'm glad people are here. Violet had an event. I thought we were going to lose some things here. And this is incredibly important. And it's really fascinating. And it really crystallized the idea, because, well, we're talking about slavery, but honestly, it's the same in the North and the South because of the identity of commodity. That's it right there. It's right there. And because it was different, we don't see it as much in the North because they were treated more like people. Okay? More like people. Not like people, but more like people. All right? And then there was more opportunity. And there was more agency. There was more opportunity to achieve some kind of freedom, but you were still marginalized. We're going to give you freedom. We're going to give you a job. We're going to allow you freedom, not even give you freedom, right? We're going to allow you freedom. But you can't buy land because we need you working over here at a minimum wage. So you need to be hungry all the time. Because if you're not hungry, the goods won't move. And if the goods don't move, the economy doesn't grow. And if the economy doesn't grow, capitalism doesn't rise. Capitalism doesn't rise. And Nathaniel Shaw Jr., who was a part of the rising merchant class, displacing the landed gentry class like Washington and Schuyler. So that's another different lecture. The seeds of the American Civil War actually beginning in the American Revolution. So there we go. A lot of themes going on here. Are there any questions? Are you done here? Are you tired of hearing me talk?
You did a really great job.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
You remember that old school commercial, how do you spell freedom? It's still going on today.
Right.
Are you free or are you not?
Yeah. Yes.
Two questions.
Sure.
One is just a scheduling question. This lecture on September 12th is actually going to be in the afternoon.
Yeah, we want to do it before Flock comes and starts burning Arnold. So I do it before Flock starts in the garden. So we don't do it in the evening because I'm not taking away from Flock. So that's why we do it in the afternoon. So you can come here, you hang out, you have a little water, listen to me talk about Benedict Arnold and who he is, and then you can go out if you want and watch Flock burn them because it's a Saturday.
What time is that?
The other question I have, when he was working as a cook,
Yeah.
and other enslaved men were working as cooks, could they get to the point where they just preparing the meals, or could they get to the point where they were helping provision the ship before a voyage?
Okay, so so I have some experience because it doesn't change. I was in the Navy for 10 years.
Steve, really quick for the audience on the chat, can you repeat the question? Because they can't.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, since Caesar Shaw was a cook, we need to get you one of those like microphones you can bring people over there back in. So it'll get you out of the chair. So if Caesar Shaw was a cook, was that the only thing he did? And the answer to that is he did that at sea, okay, but he might have had a watch post because he would, so he would be in charge of, as the cook, he would be in charge of food provisions and rationing. He would also have a battle station, so he wasn't cooking during battle. And then when he was moving, supplies on, but there were things that everybody did, no matter what. And at a war, and in battle, he had a battle station, so he was fighting somewhere, somehow. He was manning it. He was probably on a gun crew, because topmen were topmen, and you didn't put them on gun crews. So he was probably on a gun crew as ship's cook. But he would be, and he would be the one who would give out the sailors as they came in. He would give them out the rations so they could cook, and then he would prepare meals for the officers and the captain. But they would come to him and get their salt pork and their beans, their cup of beans for the mess, the messmates. So there'd be 4 people assigned to a mess, and they'd assign one guy to get and he would cook it, and they would eat. So, any other questions? All right, thank you all for coming. This was very lively. I appreciate it. I enjoyed myself mainly because of you folks. Thank you so much. Thank you.